I'm going to be talking with my dad about lithium, and he can't see the screen, so bear with us. We were just talking about what is lithium, and I think you were saying that you're aware of its use in psychiatry, vaguely. But okay, so I have a screen up in front of me. It's the periodic table of the elements, and lithium is on the far left side, and it's one of the first elements created after the Big Bang. So it's actually element number 3. They're numbered. Hydrogen is number 1, helium is number 2, and lithium is number 3. The numbers also correspond to the number of protons in the nucleus. And so hydrogen has essentially 1 proton and 1 electron. And then helium has 2 protons and 2 electrons. And lithium has 3 protons and 3 electrons. And it happens to have, the most common form happens to have 4 neutrons. But let's just ignore the neutrons for a minute. So lithium has this atomic number of 3, and it's on the left side of the periodic table, and that's important. All of the elements on the left side basically give away electrons very easily. And then all the furthest right on the periodic table, they neither take nor gain electrons, but the ones one in from the far right, they are very eager to grab electrons. Alkali metals is what we call the ones on the far left, and the ones that are eager to get electrons, they're called the halogens. And when they're put together, they're salts. And the one you're most familiar with, or everybody's most familiar with, is table salt is sodium, which is one down from lithium in its column, and chlorine, which is just over on the same row as sodium. So basically, when you put a salt in water, the alkali, the one on the far left, gives away its electron. It becomes positively charged, and it's called a cation. And the one on the right takes that electron and becomes negatively charged, and it's called an anion. So you put your table salt in water, and it dissolves, and then you get a cation and an anion. In this case, lithium almost always comes as a salt, and it becomes, in the solution, it's lithium plus, which means it's lost 1 electron. There are a variety of types of salts. It's commonly found in salt form. The typical psychiatric medicine is lithium carbonate. It's a metal, it's an alkali metal, and it dissolves as a salt in solution and in the body. Maybe because you're not used to thinking about the metals that are on the far left of the periodic table. You're probably used to thinking of iron or gold. Those are all metals. Essentially, a huge portion of the periodic table are metals. Potassium is very similar does a lot of similar things to lithium, and I'm quite interested in potassium. Technically, it's a metal, although it's in food. Copper, zinc are probably in supplements I've given you, and they're definitely metals as well. But we can't really make any gross generalizations about metals. Some are terrible for you, and like mercury is also a metal, and it's terrible. Lead's a metal, terrible for you. You don't want to. So we don't want to make any generalizations there. I've been spending a lot of time looking into potassium, which is chemically very closely related, and I realized I had not done a more thorough job on lithium. There have been a number of really interesting findings in lithium. It was already known to help with mania and depression. It can basically prevent depression, and it can treat mania. It doesn't seem to be able to treat depression once it's started, but it's a prophylactic for most of the dementias, including Alzheimer's. So that's the big one. And it seems to prevent all-cause mortality. So that means from everything. So I'm trying to figure out plausible reasons why that might be the case. And I think it's because it blocks certain stress hormones, and then by doing that, it allows more blood and oxygen and nutrients to get to essentially all the tissues, and that's the main mechanism of action. Now, there are other molecules that the literature talks about it hitting, but those are secondary in my opinion. The typical way they talk about it in the literature is not like I'm just talking about it, although I think both are true. There's literature saying it essentially blocks adrenaline, and then there's literature talking about it on the cellular level and how it inhibits this thing called GSK3, which basically is involved in all kinds of cellular signaling of stress. I think it's a composite thing. I'm looking at the total system level, and the researchers are looking at the just cellular only level. So I think they're both consistent. In the model that I'm going to be articulating, if someone is essentially less stressed, they are increasing their metabolism, they're perfusing their brain and their peripheral tissues with blood, they're getting better digestion, and they're much more likely to live healthier and longer lives. We already have proof of more longevity with lithium. So that's like a given. It's just that the mechanisms are still being worked out. And so I'm offering a slightly different view than the sort of a low-level biochemical view, which is, I think, also true. It's just not the whole story. I'm not a medical professional, but based on the literature, it looks like it's a good idea for me and others, human beings, to ingest the appropriate amount of lithium to live longer. Now, what the appropriate amount probably depends on someone's potential for kidney disease, and they should check with their doctor. There are dramatically different doses for, say, health effects versus pharmaceutical effects. For cases of mania and bipolar, they use 1,000 milligrams or more a day, or like on the order of 1,000 milligrams, which is 1 gram. And in the studies where they're showing longevity, they're getting it from their drinking water in the order of half a milligram. So there's some sweet spot that is somewhere around a milligram, or maybe slightly more or less than a milligram for longevity. And then there's a known toxic effect of persistent use of, I'm going to call it high doses, but like greater than 500 milligrams of lithium daily. Essentially, there's a trade-off if you're getting great psychiatric benefit from taking 500 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams, and that comes at the risk mostly of kidney failure. Why don't I'll tell you how I'm going to approach it for myself, which is for me to try to find the minimum effective dose. There's two things, I guess. One is the risks are also related to the composition of other, I'm going to call it ions in a person's diet, but especially sodium and potassium. So one is you can mitigate the risks of taking, and you should mitigate the risks of taking lithium. And the other is that there's basically, at a low dose, there's a negative risk of any kind of a problem. So minimize the dose, try to find the minimum effective dose, and then mitigate the risks. The right amount of potassium seems to be very helpful for both, like hypertension from sodium and then kidney disease from lithium. How does a person who know how to figure out the minimum effective dose? And I suggest that we just have to go to the research, which is, if you want to be precautionary, you take essentially only 1 milligram or so per day, if it's only like for longevity purposes. And then have higher doses like 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams around for times of stress, because most likely 10 milligrams for most people is also like not going to produce any negative physiological consequences, and it'll very effectively block a lot of adrenaline. However, what I've experienced is if you take 10 milligrams fairly consistently, you almost feel too relaxed. Most people will just want to reduce it to feel a little more energized. Will the effects be noticeable when I'm taking sufficient or even a little bit too much lithium? In my experience, lithium is very obvious at the 10 and 20 milligram level. And I think it's possible that if people are experiencing something on the spectrum of mania or bipolar, they would actually not notice that. But outside of those, the potential for those conditions, then you should definitely notice it. People with it in their drinking water don't seem to consciously notice it, but they also don't have any experience of the opposite, because it's everywhere in their world, in their local world. There are studies out of Texas and Japan where it's in relatively high concentrations in the drinking water, and that's where it's showing noticeable effects on the whole population's longevity. It's a mineral found in the dirt. It's one of the most common minerals in the universe. So in rock, essentially, it's getting leached out, and it's in the water with other minerals too. The typical conception of lithium is as a pharmaceutical for people with severe mental illness, and yet it's actually all over the place in in some populations it's in higher concentrations in the drinking water, and some it's in relatively low. It happens to have been in the soda that became 7-Up. So in 1929, 7-Up, the number 7 from 7-Up is the molecular weight of lithium, and up is because it prevented people from, essentially made them feel better, but it doesn't actually make them up in the current sense of up, but it made them feel better. It's got this like long, the name that it was originally, it was called Bib Label Lithiated Lemon Lime Soda. I released it in 1929. It had lithium citrate as the primary mood altering substance, and then the lithium was taken out in 1948. But that's how 7-Up got its name, and that's how it got started. And it's from a mineral springs in Georgia. The guy, whoever the entrepreneur is, started bottling. Let me see if I can pull up the guy. He started bottling the water and selling it, and people. No, he didn't add it. At least initially, it wasn't added as an extra. It was in the water, but they might have added it later. At some scale, they probably had to add it, but. Coca-Cola used to have an active ingredient as well. Okay, what else should I make sure I cover? That's a lot of the history. I would say the main thing I find interesting in the history is that it was a substance that it doesn't really have patent protection. Let me explain this to you. A drug has to have a novel, it has to be like new, not in nature for it to be patentable. So everything that is a natural substance is for the most part unpatentable. There is a giant void in our public or private funding for medicines that are from the most common elements and molecules that are around, because there's no financial incentive to do the appropriate clinical trials for anything that is either a natural substance or even a pharmaceutical that is old, because the patents have lapsed. So there's a lot of old drugs that are actually very useful for things that will never get the right kinds of evidence to be considered part of the modern pharmacopoeia or pharmaceutical scheduling. I find that actually something worth potentially writing a lot more about, because I feel like there's a potential public policy solution. It's bipartisan, but ultimately the pharmaceutical companies would not want the kind of competition from really cheap drugs. Lithium falls into that category, but unlike almost everything else, it has proven so effective that it got a groundswell of psychiatrists writing into the FDA asking for some kind of special authority to do a study, which then they were basically just using the lithium for that to give to their patients. So that happened in the late 60s, that basically the FDA approved it because it was just costing them too much effort to evaluate and approve all of the submissions coming in from the wave of support for lithium. So what's my conclusion? There's too many things that lithium is potentially good for. I'm reading from a Dr. Jonathan Wright, MD, in some newsletter that he wrote that I found online. But anyway, all right, here are the things that he thinks low-dose lithium can do. One, it causes the formation of new brain cells in adults, so it helps with neurogenesis. It reduces or prevents Alzheimer's disease. It protects brain cells against almost all toxins. It increases another brain protective protein. Great. It reduces brain cell death under the experience of ischemic stroke. It does other signaling for brain repair. It improves the sense of direction, which again is related to the nervous system. This is strange and it'll take me more looking into this, but it eliminates something called dermatitis. It reduces aggressive behavior. It reduces aggressive behavior in both children and adults. And it reduces depression and irritability in women and aggressive behavior, again, in men. Let's see. And it prevents relapse for addicts for both drugs and alcohol. It reduces mental health burdens for hospitals. It reduces symptoms of fibromyalgia. It can significantly reduce cluster headaches. And it's been shown to be effective topically for herpes, and I think I saw one for papillomavirus. And then it also helps fight the common cold, Epstein-Barr, and cytomegalovirus. And it treats hyperthyroidism and Graves' disease when combined with iodine. It can help treat gout when combined with vitamin C. And I've seen, but this is just not on our list, but I've seen recent studies where it's helpful in fighting cancer because it helps boost the immune system in efficient ways. And a reasonable strategy for use. I buy lithium orotate, which is actually slightly more, apparently it's slightly stronger per milligram than lithium carbonate. But the lithium orotate is readily available on Amazon, where lithium carbonate is a much harder to get pharmaceutical drug. I buy the $7 bottle of lithium orotate, 5 milligrams, and it's 120 capsules, so that's essentially 4 months worth of supply for somewhere around $7. I think if somebody wants the benefits that I've described, that they should consider lithium. I would even go further. I think it's good for relationships, and then there are more conditions I guess I'll get into later. But essentially, yes, I want to be cheeky and say if you want any of the benefits, you should check with your conscience and or your doctor and pursue as you wish. In a case of someone that is taking certain classes of blood pressure lowering medications, it's likely to make you even more drowsy or be that you would need a much smaller dose because you're retaining positive cations in your kidneys, because that's how the certain classes of drugs work. So basically, the more drugs you take, the more you got to check with your doctor to make sure that of the interactions. Unfortunately, most doctors are not going to know. So you really just need, you'll have to do the homework. You can check with me. Not that I'm going to be able to give you medical advice, but I can help steer people in the lines of how to do an investigation of what interactions there are. Assuming someone doesn't have a kidney condition and isn't taking any other major pharmaceuticals, started there as a baseline, then it seems very plausible that taking anywhere between a 0.5 milligram and 5 milligrams perpetually is like a really good idea for increasing quality and length of life. It'll cost a grand spanking $20 a year. Sorry. So, yeah, $20 a year. It's probably the best bang for buck molecule right now, and that's why I'm starting with it. Essentially, is the first thing I'm talking about. Thanks for playing along.